All right, here we are for part 2 of lesson 10-4. We're just going to do some more practice. I'm going to show you a few more ways, do another tree diagram with you, possibly. Yeah. So let's see. First example, how many different outfits can you make from the t-shirts, jeans, and shoes in the closet? So let's take a look at this closet real quick. How many t-shirts are hanging? Let's count those up. I see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There are 7 different colored t-shirts. How many different pairs of jeans are there? They're stacked up top here. I see 1, 2, 3, I see 4. And then pairs of shoes, I see 3. So to figure out how many different outfits there are, you're just going to multiply all of these together. So 7 times 4 is 28. Now do 28 times 3. That gives us 84 different outfits from this closet. All right, next, you flip 3 nickels. What's the probability of flipping 2 heads and 1 tails? Use a tree diagram to find the sample space. We're going to let H equal heads and T equal tails. So we're flipping 3 nickels. So when I flip the first nickel, my only options when you flip a nickel are heads or tails. Now when I go and flip that second nickel, it depends on what my first nickel landed on. If I landed on heads, okay, my second flip I could also land on heads, or my second flip I could land on tails. If I landed on tails first, on my second flip, I could land on heads now or land on tails. And when I go and flip that last nickel for the third time, we're still building off of our first 2 flips. So again, we're creating this tree diagram, we're branching off. So basically what you do is from each result prior, you list your possible outcomes. Again, when you flip a coin, all you can land on is heads or tails. Heads or tails. So now I want to look at what are all of my possible outcomes for all 3. I could have landed on heads, heads, heads for all 3. So an option here for my outcomes is heads, heads, heads. My next one would be heads, heads, tails. I'm just going to kind of follow the branches here and list them all out. So now I finished that branch. Let's go back. I could have heads, tails. So heads, tails, heads. Or heads, tails, tails. So I finished this whole tree. So now let's go down to my, what if I start with tails? I could have tails, heads, heads. Tails, heads, tails. So now I'm done with this branch. Let's go down here. I could have tails, tails, heads. And my last one would be tails, tails, tails. So notice how we started with heads, heads, heads. We end with tails, tails, tails. That's something good to notice. Now, how many possible outcomes are there? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different combinations. Now, out of those 8 total outcomes, I want to know the probability of flipping 2 heads and 1 tails. So take a look at all of your outcomes. Which one has 2 heads, 1 tails? See how these have 2 heads, 1 tails? Nope, that's 2 tails. 2 heads, 1 tails. Nope, nope, nope. So see how only 3 out of the 8? So the probability of flipping 2 heads and 1 tails would be 3 out of 8. And this last example. So this is where we're finding the probability of the compound events. So when you're finding the probability of compound events, you find the probability of each separate event and then multiply them together. So let's take a look. What's the probability of spinning a 1? So look at your spinner. There's only 1 1 out of the 5 spaces. So the probability of spinning a 1 is 1/5. What's the probability of flipping heads? Well, you only have 1 heads out of your sides are either heads or tails, so out of 2. Now I want to know the probability of both of these events happening, so I'm going to multiply them together. So when we multiply fractions, just multiply across the top and the bottom. 1 times 1 is 1, 5 times 2 is 10. The probability of spinning a 1 and flipping heads is 1/10. Let's continue. What's the probability of spinning an even number? I see 2, 4, I see 2 out of the 5 spots. And what's the probability of flipping heads? Well, there's only 1 head out of the 2 options. Now multiply them together. Again, if you want to cross simplify or simplify at the end, it doesn't matter. You would get 1/5. The last one, what's the probability of not spinning a 5? So how many numbers are not 5? Well, 4 out of the 5. And what's the probability of flipping tails? 1/2. Again, if you wanted to cross simplify, so the probability of not spinning a 5 and flipping tails is 2/5.